The thin gold band was a circle of failure. Allure pressed it into the cool laminate of the pharmacy counter, the metal digging a faint line into her thumb. It was all she had left of her grandmother, a whisper of a memory now being bartered for a box of fever reducers and a bottle of cough syrup. "Please," she said, her voice low and even, a stark contrast to the frantic hummingbird wings of her heart. "It's real gold. It has to be enough." The pharmacist, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, looked from the ring to her, then back again. He picked it up as if it were contaminated, weighing it in his palm. "This isn't a pawn shop. We take currency. Or a prescription card." "My mother is sick," Allure said, the words tasting like ash. "Her fever is high. I just need enough to get her through the night. I get paid on Friday. I can come back and buy it back from you. With interest." "Not my policy," he sniffed, placing the ring back on the counter and pushing it toward her with a single, dismissive finger. Defeat was a cold, heavy thing. It settled in her bones, making the short walk back to the door feel like a mile. She curled her fingers around the ring, its familiar shape a painful reminder of her inadequacy. She worked 60 hours a week cleaning a house so large it could swallow her own apartment building whole, yet she couldn't afford a $10 bottle of medicine. That was when the air in the small pharmacy changed. The temperature seemed to drop, the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights fading into a dense, watchful silence. The door hadn't chimed, but someone was there. Allure didn't turn. She didn't have to. She felt the presence behind her, a column of stillness and absolute authority. She recognized the scent first, a subtle, clean fragrance of cedarwood and something sharp, like winter air. It was the scent that clung to the silk sheets in the master suite, the one she stripped and remade with meticulous care every morning. The scent of her employer, Kaito Tanaka. She risked a glance at the reflection in the glass of the refrigerated section. He stood just inside the doorway, a ghost in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the pharmacist, a look so devoid of emotion it was more terrifying than any overt threat. He moved like the room owed him space, and the room seemed to agree, shrinking away from him. The pharmacist's pinched expression had melted into a waxy mask of fear. His eyes were wide, fixed on the man at the door. He suddenly looked back at Allure, his hands trembling slightly. "Wait," the pharmacist stammered, his voice suddenly thick. "The medicine. Just take it." He shoved the box and the bottle across the counter toward her. "No chari." Allure stared at him, then at the reflection of Kaito in the glass. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. He had done nothing but exist in the space, and it had bent the world to his will. She didn't want this charity, not like this. It felt dirty, coerced. But the image of her mother, shivering beneath a thin blanket, eclipsed her pride. She scooped up the medicine, her knuckles brushing against the ring she'd almost lost. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling hollow. She didn't look at Kaito as she pushed past him, her shoulder nearly brushing the fine wool of his suit. She fled the store, the chime of the door sounding like an alarm behind her. She didn't look back. She told herself it was survival instinct. The next day, the mansion was quiet, as it always was. Allure moved through the cavernous rooms with an efficiency that bordered on invisibility. She polished marble until it reflected the sky. She erased every fingerprint, every speck of dust, restoring the home to its state of pristine, untouchable perfection. It was a house that felt more like a museum than a home, a monument to power and discipline. She avoided the East Wing, where Kaito's office was. She focused on her tasks, her hands moving with practiced surety, but her mind was a tempest. The medicine had worked. Her mother's fever had broken just after midnight. Relief was a sharp, painful pang in her chest, but it was tainted by the knowledge of how she'd gotten it. A debt had been created, and men like Kaito Tanaka always collected. In the small, sterile break room for the staff, a plain white paper bag sat on the table, directly in front of her designated chair. Her name, Allure, was written on it in severe, black ink. Her breath caught. Inside were not one, but a dozen boxes of the fever reducer and a half-dozen bottles of the cough syrup. Enough to last a year. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a statement. I saw you. I know your weakness. You owe me. An hour later, one of his guards, a man built like a bulldog with dead eyes, found her in the library. Tanaka-sama wants to see you. The walk to the East Wing was the longest of her life. The air grew cooler, the silence more profound. The guard opened the heavy oak door to Kaido's office and closed it behind her, the click of the latch echoing like a cell door locking. Kaido sat behind a vast, empty desk of polished black granite. The city of Tokyo sprawled out behind him through a floor-to-ceiling window, a glittering, indifferent backdrop. He wore another immaculate suit, this one the color of midnight. He gestured to the chair opposite him. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her with more than a passing nod. She sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She would not show fear. He watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes analytical, unreadable. They were the color of wet stone. You are a diligent worker, Allure, he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the sound in the room. He said her name differently than anyone else had. It wasn't a question or a statement, but a claim. You are clean, efficient. You leave no trace of yourself. Thank you, sir. He ignored her politeness. From now on, you'll be responsible for my personal quarters exclusively. You will serve my meals here. You will be available when I am in residence. It wasn't a promotion. It was a shortening of her leash. She would be moved from the relative anonymity of the general staff to the very center of the spider's web. I understand. I don't think you do, he said, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. You will see things. You will hear things. You will speak of none of them. You will forget them the moment you leave the room. Your discretion is not a request. It is a condition of your continued health. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the same calm neutrality he might use to order tea. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. My mother's health is the only thing that matters to me. I will be discreet. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a chilling, predatory expression. I know. That was the moment everything changed. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was a witness, a confidant by force, bound to him by a debt of medicine and fear. The next few weeks were a lesson in terror and tension. Allure moved through Kaido's private world, a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. She learned the cadence of his days, the pre-dawn meetings, the long, silent afternoons spent staring at the city, the late nights when men with hard faces and ink crawling up their necks would arrive and speak in hushed, urgent tones behind the closed doors of his study. She served him tea, her hands steady as she poured the steaming liquid into a delicate porcelain cup. He never thanked her, but his eyes would follow her movements, tracking her with an unnerving intensity. She learned to feel his gaze on her skin, a physical weight. She saw the machinery of his empire. She saw a man kneel before him, begging for forgiveness for some unseen failure, and saw Kaido dismiss him with a flick of his fingers, his face a mask of bored indifference. The man was gone the next day. She saw the deference of politicians and police captains who came to him, their heads bowed, their expensive suits looking cheap in his presence. He was not just a boss. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, and his palace was this sterile, silent mansion. His private suite was as austere as the rest of the house, with one exception. On a low table next to a severe-looking armchair, there was a single, silver-framed photograph, always angled away from the door. For weeks, she cleaned around it, respecting the invisible boundary. She told herself she didn't want to know. One afternoon, while dusting the table, her cloth snagged on the corner of the frame, turning it just enough. The face in the photograph was female, with Kaido's same dark, intense eyes and high cheekbones. She wasn't smiling. She was staring at the camera with a look of fierce, unbroken defiance. There was a sadness in her expression, but no fear. Her name was Hannah. Allure jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kaido stood in the doorway, watching her. He hadn't made a sound. She felt a hot flush of shame, as if she'd been caught reading his diary. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." He walked into the room, his gaze fixed on the photograph. The cold mask he always wore seemed to crack, just for a second, revealing a chasm of old, raw pain beneath. "She was my older sister." He picked up the frame, his thumb stroking the glass over the woman's face. "When our father died, the Ishikawa clan saw an opportunity. They thought our family was weak, fractured. They took her to force a concession on a territory dispute." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but the silence between his words was heavy with it. "I was too young, too reckless. I paid their price to get her back. But what they returned," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "They broke her spirit. She was never the same. She took her own life 6 months later." He set the photograph back down, angling it away again, hiding it from the world. "I failed to protect her. A shame my family will carry forever. I rectified the situation. The Ishikawa clan no longer has a leader from that generation." He said it with the finality of an executioner. He looked at Allura, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold control in his eyes. She saw the wound he carried, the ghost that haunted his silent house. He was showing her a piece of himself, a shard of his broken past. It was a warning. "This is what happens to those I fail to protect. This is the price of my world." The war with the new Ishikawa-gumi escalated a week later. It came without warning. A sudden, deafening explosion from the garden shattered the afternoon quiet, and a pane of glass in the library, where Allura had been shelving books. She threw herself to the floor as the window imploded, showering the Persian rug with glittering shards. Men in black suits swarmed the grounds, guns drawn. The mansion, usually a place of tomb-like silence, was filled with shouts and the crackle of radios. In the chaos, Allura saw her chance. A service corridor leading to the kitchens was clear. From there, a door to the outside was almost certainly unguarded. She could run. She could disappear back into the city, back to her tiny apartment and her old life. It was a life of poverty and struggle, but it was hers. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of run, run, run. She took 2 steps toward the corridor and then stopped. Through the shattered window, she saw Kaido on the lawn, directing his men with cold, economical gestures. He was focused outward, on the assassins trying to breach his walls. He didn't see the threat inside. One of his own guards, a man she recognized from the kitchen rotation, was moving up behind him. His hand was hidden inside his jacket, and his eyes held a venomous, desperate gleam. A traitor. He was less than 10 feet from Kaido. Every instinct screamed at her to save herself. This was not her fight. This was not her world. Kaido was a monster, a killer who had held her captive with a quiet threat. But she also saw the man who carried the photograph of his lost sister. The man whose silent grief filled every room of this house. She didn't think. She acted. "Kaido." Her voice, sharp with terror, cut through the noise. He turned, his eyes instantly finding hers. He saw the direction of her terrified gaze, and his body reacted a fraction of a second before his mind could have processed the information. He spun, disarming the traitor with a brutal, fluid motion that was too fast to follow. The knife clattered to the grass. 2 other guards were on the traitor instantly, dragging him away. Kaido's eyes locked back on hers. He saw her, standing in the ruined library, surrounded by shattered glass. He saw her choice. He knew she could have run. Later, after the silence had returned, more menacing than before, he found her in the hallway. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her trembling. He backed her against the wall, his body caging hers in, shielding her from the sight of his men cleaning up the aftermath. His scent, cedar and cold air, enveloped her. He didn't speak. He lifted a hand and brushed his thumb across her jaw, a rough, possessive gesture, checking for injuries. His touch was electric, a shock that jolted through her entire body. His eyes burned into hers, dark and fathomless. He wasn't thanking her. He was branding her. In his world, Saving the king meant you belonged to the king. And she had just saved him. The escape she'd rejected was now gone forever. He moved her into a suite of rooms in the main residence that night. "For your security," was the only explanation he offered. The cage shrank, its bars now gilded with silk sheets and private bathrooms. Her old apartment, her mother, her entire former life felt like a dream she was slowly forgetting. She was his now, in a way that had nothing to do with her employment. The war with the Ishikawagumi bled into the city's streets. The news spoke of gang violence, of unsolved arsons and public shootouts. To Allura, it was the sound of Kaido's world breathing. One evening, he was late. Hours late. The mansion was wound tight with a nervous energy she could feel in the polished floors. His lieutenant, a grim-faced man named Ryota, paced the foyer, his phone pressed to his ear. Allura waited in the kitchen, pretending to polish silver that was already gleaming. Every siren she heard in the distance made her stomach clench. She imagined his car, riddled with bullets. She imagined his cold, still face. The thought brought a terrifying, unwelcome ache to her chest. She hated him for the danger he represented, for the life he had stolen from her. But the thought of him being gone, of that intense, silent presence being extinguished from the world, left her feeling hollow and adrift. When he finally walked through the door just before dawn, the entire mansion seemed to exhale. He was unharmed, but his suit was disheveled, and there was a dark bruise forming high on his cheekbone. He walked straight past Ryota, his eyes finding Allura in the kitchen doorway. The relief that washed over her was so potent it made her dizzy. It was a feeling she had no right to, a feeling that disgusted her. He saw it in her face. He saw her fear for him, and a muscle feathered in his jaw. They had captured one of the ambushers. They brought him to the basement. Allura tried to block out the sounds, but the thick walls of the house couldn't contain the muffled grunts of pain. After an hour, Kaido came upstairs, his face like thunder. The man wasn't talking. Something broke in Allura. This cycle of violence would never end. It would just continue until he was dead, or all his enemies were. She walked down the stone steps to the basement. The captured man was tied to a chair, his face a bloody mess. Kaido stood over him, a cold instrument in his hand. Ryota stood by, impassive. "Stop," she said, her voice echoing in the damp air. Kaido turned to her, his eyes blazing. "This does not concern you. Let me talk to him," she said, her gaze fixed on the broken man. She had seen the guards empty his pockets upstairs. She'd seen the worn photo in his wallet, an old woman in a garden, smiling. His mother. Kaido stared at her a long, calculating look. He gave a curt nod to Ryota, who stepped back. Kaido remained, watching, a silent predator in the corner. Allura knelt in front of the man. She spoke softly, not about territory or bosses, but about the smell of medicine in a sick room, about the fear of hearing a shallow cough in the middle of the night. She told him about her own mother, about the ring she'd almost sold. She didn't offer him mercy or a deal. She offered him a moment of shared humanity in a world that had none. Tears tracked through the blood on the man's face. He broke. He whispered a location, a time. The next meeting of the Ishikawa leadership. She had done it. She had stepped over a line she could never uncross. She had used her own pain as a weapon in his war. Later, she stood by the massive window in his office, watching the lights of Tokyo. She felt his presence behind her long before he spoke. "You have a rare skill," Kaido said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "You see the cracks in a person's soul." She didn't turn. "Is that what you see in me?" "I see a survivor," he corrected. "But you fight with a different kind of weapon. You build bridges to a man's weakness." "I only know how to burn them." He was closer now. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I burn everything. Everyone." He paused, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, a confession that felt more intimate than a kiss. "Until you." The words hung in the air, dangerous and fragile. He was admitting her effect on him. He was telling her she was the exception to his scorched earth life. The bridge she had built, however, had a toll. The Ishikawagumi were not fools. They knew their man had broken. They knew how. If they couldn't get to the monster in the mansion, they would go for the woman who had somehow touched his heart. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She answered it, and a distorted voice spoke a single sentence. "We know about your mother," an image came through. Her mother, asleep in her bed in the old apartment, with the shadow of a masked man falling over her. The demand was simple. The service gate at the north end of the estate. Midnight. Unlocked. The blood drained from Alara's face. It was a trap. A blatant, obvious trap to get Kaito out in the open. They wanted to trade her mother for his life. She looked at the clock. She had 2 hours. She couldn't tell him. He would lock her in a room and walk into the ambush himself, and his pride would get him killed. This was her fault. Her debt. Her fight. She walked into his study. She knew where he kept a small, elegant pistol, tucked away in a locked drawer of his desk. She'd seen him place it there once. Getting it was a risk, but it was nothing compared to the risk of doing nothing. With trembling fingers, she picked the simple lock with a hairpin, the way she'd seen it done in movies, her heart pounding with each scrape of metal. The gun was cold and heavy in her hand. It felt alien wrong. She wasn't going to the gate to let them in. She was going to be a diversion. She would fire the gun, draw them away from the house, away from him. She would buy him time. It was a foolish plan, born of desperation, but it was a plan. The north gate was at the farthest edge of the garden, shrouded in darkness. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. She clutched the pistol, her hand slick with sweat. As the clock on her phone ticked over to midnight, she saw them. 3 shadows detaching themselves from the deeper darkness of the street beyond the gate. She raised the gun, her arms shaking. "Don't." Kaito's voice came from the darkness to her right. He stepped out from behind a sculpted cypress tree, not alone. A dozen of his men materialized from the shadows, silent and lethal, forming a semicircle around the gate. He had known. Of course, he had known. He saw everything. The look on her face after the phone call had been enough. "You should have come to me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He took the gun from her trembling hand, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was a reprimand and a reassurance all at once. The men at the gate realized they'd walked into a slaughterhouse. Their leader, a man with a jagged scar across his face, grabbed his radio. But before he could speak, Kaito's men opened fire. It wasn't a battle, it was a surgical execution. In the chaos, one man, faster and more desperate than the rest, vaulted the gate. It was Ishikawa's new heir, a man named Kenji. He moved with a snake's speed, and before Alara could react, he had an arm around her throat, a knife pressed to her skin. "Call them off, Tanaka." Kenji screamed, his breath hot and panicked against her ear. "Or she dies." Kaito's men froze. Kaito himself stood 20 feet away, his expression unreadable, his own gun held loosely at his side. He looked past Kenji, his dark eyes locking onto Alara's. There was no fear in his gaze, only a terrifying, absolute certainty. "He will kill you anyway," Kaito said, his voice calm, directed only at her. "It is his only move. Do you trust me, Alara?" She was in the arms of a killer, a knife at her throat, and the most dangerous man in Tokyo was asking her to trust him with her life. The world narrowed to the space between their eyes. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't just a monster. He was her monster. She gave a single sharp nod. Without breaking eye contact with him, she stomped her heel down hard on Kenji's instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Kaito needed. The crack of his pistol was deafening. Kenji cried out, not in death, but in agony, and crumpled to the ground, clutching a shattered kneecap. Kaito hadn't aimed to kill. He had aimed to cripple, to humiliate. A display of utter control. He had trusted her to move, and she had trusted him not to miss. The aftermath was swift and silent. Kaito's men cleaned up the mess. Her mother was moved that night, taken from the shabby apartment to a private, secure medical facility with round-the-clock care. She was safe. She was comfortable. And she was a prisoner of Kaido's protection, just as Allure was. The cost of their safety was their freedom. Allure could never go back. Her old life had been burned away, leaving only this one, here, in the shadow of this man. Weeks passed. The city healed. The war was over. Kaido had won. The mansion returned to its state of profound quiet. Allure moved through its rooms, no longer just a housekeeper, no longer just a witness. She was something more, something undefined. She was in the garden one evening, watching the koi drift like orange silk through the dark water of the pond. He found her there, coming to stand beside her. The setting sun cast long shadows across the perfectly raked gravel. For a long time, they just stood in the shared silence that had become their language. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm, gleaming in the twilight, was the thin gold band. Her grandmother's ring. He had found the pharmacy, found the disapproving man, and retrieved it. The last piece of her old life. She looked at the ring, then up at his face. His expression was serious, expectant. He was offering her a choice. To take back her past, or to accept her future. She didn't take the ring. Instead, she slowly, deliberately slid her hand into his. His fingers, strong and sure, closed around hers. He didn't hold the ring, he held her. The metal of the forgotten band was cool against his palm, but the warmth of her hand in his was a promise. A contract. A claim. The choice was made. She was staying.